My name is Dr. Claire Morrison, and the night I discovered my husband had been lying to me for 6 months. I was measuring out his evening medication with the same gentle precision I'd used every single day since his accident. The little white pills clicked against the glass as I counted them, and I remember thinking how routine had become my lifeline. Routine was what kept me sane when the man I'd loved for 8 years couldn't remember my name. But that night, everything changed. That night, I learned that Jonathan hadn't forgotten me at all. Let me start from the beginning, back when my world still made sense. Dr. Jonathan Pierce was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner. Brilliant, respected, with hands that could perform the most delicate neurosurgeries, and still be gentle enough to braid my hair on Sunday mornings. We met during my residency at Johns Hopkins, where he was already an established professor of neurology. I was drawn to his intensity, the way he could lose himself completely in his work, emerging hours later with that satisfied smile that meant he'd solved another impossible case. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but it was solid. We both worked long hours, often ships passing in the night, but when we were together, we were truly together. He would tell me about his research, and I would share stories from my forensic pathology practice. We understood each other's dedication to medicine, the weight of holding lives in our hands. The accident happened on a Tuesday. Jonathan was driving home from the hospital, after a particularly complex surgery, when a drunk driver ran a red light. The irony wasn't lost on me, a neurologist suffering a traumatic brain injury. The doctors at the trauma center were colleagues, friends who looked at me with that mixture of professional concern and personal grief that I knew all too well from my own work. The diagnosis was devastating. Severe retrograde amnesia with possible permanent memory impairment. Jonathan could remember his medical training, could still read an MRI scan with the same expertise he'd always had. But everything personal, our wedding day, our anniversary trips, the way I took my coffee, even my name, it was all gone. The man I loved was trapped inside a brain that no longer recognized love. I took a leave of absence from my practice without hesitation. Jonathan needed round-the-clock care, and the idea of strangers handling his recovery was unbearable. His insurance covered some home health care, but I wanted to be the one helping him rebuild his life. I wanted to be the one there when his memories returned, because I refused to believe they wouldn't. Those first months were the hardest of my life. Jonathan was confused, often agitated, sometimes frightened by my presence. I was a stranger to him, trying to convince him that we'd shared a life together. I showed him photo albums, played videos of our wedding, told him stories about our first date until my voice was hoarse. He would listen politely, the way you might listen to someone describing a movie you'd never seen. "I'm sorry," he would say, and the kindness in his voice made it worse somehow. "I can see this is important to you, but I just don't remember. None of it feels real." I learned to be patient in ways I never knew were possible. I restructured our entire house, removing anything that might confuse or overwhelm him. I created new routines, new memories, hoping they might somehow unlock the old ones. I cooked his favorite meals at least, the ones he used to love, and watched as he ate them with the polite appreciation of a grateful stranger. The neurologist overseeing Jonathan's case, Dr. Sarah Chen, became both my lifeline and my source of hope. She explained that while Jonathan's condition was severe, there were documented cases of patients recovering memories months, or even years after their initial trauma. "The brain is remarkably adaptable, Claire," she told me during one of our weekly consultations. "Jonathan's personality, his core sense of self, those are still intact. The pathways to his personal memories may just need time to rebuild. Your presence, your patience, it's more valuable than any medication I could prescribe." So I waited, and I watched. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Jonathan began to improve. It started with small things. He began to anticipate my routines, having his coffee ready when I came downstairs in the morning. He started asking about my day, not out of politeness but with genuine curiosity. He would catch me humming and ask about the song, then remember my answer the next day. These tiny victories felt monumental. About 4 months after the accident, Jonathan had what seemed like his first real breakthrough. We were sitting in our garden, something we'd done every evening as part of his rehabilitation routine, when he suddenly turned to me with tears in his eyes. "Claire," he said, and my name in his mouth sounded like coming home. "I remember you. Not everything, but I remember loving you. I cried harder than I had since the accident. It felt like the first ray of sunlight after an endless winter. From that moment on, Jonathan's recovery accelerated dramatically. He began remembering fragments of our life together, our first apartment, our honeymoon in Italy, the way I would steal his fries even when I ordered my own. Each recovered memory was a gift, a piece of our life returned to me. Dr. Chen was amazed by his progress. This is remarkable, Claire. I've rarely seen such a comprehensive recovery from this type of injury. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. But even as I celebrated Jonathan's improvement, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Maybe it was the way he remembered some things with perfect clarity, while other memories remained frustratingly elusive. Or maybe it was how his recovered memories always seemed to align perfectly with the stories I'd told him during those early, difficult months. The first real crack in my faith appeared during what should have been a moment of pure joy. We were going through old photo albums, something that had become part of our nightly routine. Jonathan had been remembering more and more details about the pictures, filling in context and emotions that had been lost. But that night, he told me a story about our vacation to Napa Valley that I'd never shared with him. "Remember how you spilled red wine on that white dress?" he said, laughing at a photo of me in what was indeed a white sundress. "You were so embarrassed, but I thought you looked beautiful anyway." The problem was, I'd never spilled wine on that dress. I remembered that day perfectly. It was one of our first trips together, and I'd been careful to the point of anxiety about everything. I would have remembered spilling wine. But Jonathan was so confident, so happy to be sharing what he believed was a recovered memory, that I didn't have the heart to correct him. I told myself it was natural. Memory is imperfect even under the best circumstances, and Jonathan's brain was still healing. Maybe I was the one misremembering. Maybe in my stress and grief, I'd forgotten details from our life together. But as the weeks passed, these discrepancies multiplied. Jonathan would remember conversations we'd never had, places we'd never been together, people we'd never met. When I gently questioned these memories, he would look confused, sometimes hurt, as if I were the one with the faulty memory. "Claire, are you feeling okay?" he asked one evening after I'd questioned his recollection of a dinner we'd supposedly shared with his colleague Dr. Martinez. "You seem stressed. Maybe you should talk to someone about this." The irony of my brain, injured husband suggesting I needed therapy wasn't lost on me, but it planted a seed of doubt. Was I losing my grip on reality? Was the strain of the past months affecting my own memory? I made an appointment with Dr. Chen, ostensibly to discuss Jonathan's progress, but really to seek reassurance about my own mental state. "Jonathan's recovery has been extraordinary," she confirmed. "His cognitive function tests are all within normal ranges. As for these memory discrepancies you're concerned about, it's not unusual for trauma patients to confabulate, essentially, to fill in gaps in their memory with plausible but inaccurate details. It's a normal part of the healing process." Her explanation made sense, and I felt some of my anxiety ease. Confabulation was a documented phenomenon. I was being hypervigilant, probably traumatized in my own way by the months of stress and uncertainty. But then came the night that changed everything. I'd gone to bed early, exhausted from a particularly challenging day. Jonathan had experienced what seemed like a setback, struggling to remember basic details about his work that had been clear the day before. Dr. Chen assured me this was normal. Recovery wasn't always linear, but it had shaken my confidence in his progress. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of Jonathan's voice downstairs. My first thought was panic. Was he having another episode? Had he wandered off in confusion? I slipped out of bed and crept to the top of the stairs, listening. But what I heard wasn't confusion. It was Jonathan's voice, clear and confident, engaged in what sounded like a phone conversation. No, she doesn't suspect anything," he was saying. "The performance is flawless. She's completely convinced that I'm slowly recovering my memories of our life together." My blood turned to ice. Performance. "The beautiful thing is, she's providing all the source material herself," Jonathan continued, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Every story she tells me about our past, every photo she shows me, every detail about our relationship, I just feed it back to her weeks later as a recovered memory, and she's so grateful, so relieved, that she never questions it." I gripped the banister so hard my knuckles went white. This couldn't be real. I had to be dreaming, or maybe I was the one with the brain injury. Of course there are some inconsistencies, Jonathan was saying. Sometimes I embellish the stories, add details that make them more romantic, more meaningful, she notices. But I've trained her to doubt her own memory. Poor Claire, she's so desperate for me to get better that she's willing to gaslight herself. The cruelty in his tone, the casual way he spoke my name, made bile rise in my throat. This was my husband, the man I'd sacrificed everything to care for, talking about me like I was a lab rat in an experiment. Vivian, darling, you have to understand, this is groundbreaking research. We're documenting the entire process of how easily human memory can be manipulated, how love makes people vulnerable to psychological conditioning. Claire has become the perfect subject, Vivian. The name hit me like a physical blow, Dr. Vivian Ross, Jonathan's research partner, and, I now realized, so much more. I'd met her several times before the accident. She was brilliant, ambitious, and beautiful in that effortless way that had always made me feel slightly inadequate. I'd never suspected there was anything between them, but then again, I'd been naive about a lot of things. The paper we're going to publish from this data will revolutionize our understanding of memory, trauma, and psychological manipulation, Jonathan continued. Claire's detailed journals of my recovery process, combined with the video recordings I've been making of our interactions, will provide unprecedented documentation of induced false memory syndrome. Video recordings. He'd been recording me, documenting my grief, my hope, my desperate love like I was some kind of specimen. Every tender moment I'd thought we were sharing, every small victory I'd celebrated, had been nothing more than data collection. I know it seems cruel, Jonathan said, and for a moment I thought I heard a flicker of conscience in his voice. But then he laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. But Claire was always too emotional, too clingy. This way, she's actually contributing something valuable to science, instead of just dragging me down with her neediness. I had to press my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. Too emotional, too clingy. Is that how he'd always seen me? Had our entire marriage been a lie, or was this cruelty a new development? The timeline is perfect, Jonathan continued. I'll let this charade continue for another few months, documenting her increasing psychological dependence, and her willingness to accept false memories. Then I'll stage a complete recovery, and divorce her. By then, we'll have enough material for multiple publications. Claire will be so broken by the betrayal, that she won't be in any condition to challenge our findings. My legs gave out. I sank to the floor of the upstairs hallway, trying to process what I'd just learned. My husband, the man I'd loved, cared for, sacrificed my career for had never lost his memory at all. The accident had been real. But his amnesia was completely fabricated. For 6 months, he'd been conducting a psychological experiment on me, using my love as a weapon against my sanity. And his partner in this cruelty was the woman he was planning to leave me for. I don't know how long I sat there on the cold floor, listening to Jonathan wrap up his call with promises to see Vivian soon and assurances that their research was proceeding perfectly. When I finally heard him hang up and start moving around downstairs, I forced myself to stand and slip back into our bedroom. But I didn't sleep, I couldn't, my mind was racing, trying to reconcile the man I'd married with the monster I'd just overheard. How long had this been planned? Had Jonathan been cheating on me before the accident? Or was this elaborate deception the beginning of his affair with Vivian? More importantly, what was I going to do about it? My first instinct was confrontation. I wanted to march downstairs and demand answers, to scream at him for his cruelty, to make him face what he'd done to me. But something held me back. Maybe it was the clinical part of my mind, the forensic pathologist, who knew that evidence gathered in anger was often inadmissible. Or maybe it was pure survival instinct. If Jonathan could orchestrate something this elaborate, this psychologically devastating, what else was he capable of? Instead, I lay in bed and planned. I thought about everything I'd observed over the past months, reinterpreting Jonathan's behavior through the lens of this new, horrible knowledge. His recovery had indeed been remarkably convenient. His confabulated memories always served to make our relationship seem more romantic, more meaningful than it had actually been. His concern for my mental state, his suggestions that I seek therapy, had been designed to make me doubt my own perceptions. He'd been gaslighting me with surgical precision. By morning, I'd made my decision. I wouldn't confront Jonathan directly. Instead, I would give him exactly what he thought he wanted, a compliant wife who believed his lies. But while he thought he was conducting an experiment on me, I would be conducting one on him. The difference was, mine would have consequences. I began my counter-investigation the next day. While Jonathan was at what he claimed were his rehabilitation appointments, but which I now suspected were meetings with Vivian, I searched our house systematically. I found the hidden cameras in our bedroom, living room, and kitchen, all positioned to capture my most vulnerable moments. I found his real medical files, which showed that his cognitive function had never been impaired. I found love letters from Vivian, dating back to before the accident, proving that their affair had been ongoing for months before Jonathan decided to fake his amnesia. But the most damning evidence was Jonathan's research notes, hidden in a folder labeled Project Memory Lane, page after page of detailed observations about my behavior, my emotional responses, my increasing psychological dependence on his recovery. He'd documented everything with clinical detachment, how many times I cried each day, how my sleep patterns had changed, how I'd isolated myself from friends and family to focus on his care. Reading those notes was like seeing myself through the eyes of a predator. Every kindness I'd shown him, every sacrifice I'd made, was reduced to data points in his sick experiment. But Jonathan had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated me. You see, before I'd specialized in forensic pathology, I'd spent 2 years in psychiatry. I understood psychological manipulation, gaslighting, and induced dependency. More importantly, I understood how to document it properly. I began keeping my own records, but unlike Jonathan's clinical observations, mine would hold up in court. I photographed the hidden cameras, before carefully repositioning them to capture different angles. I made copies of all his research notes and correspondence with Vivian. I began recording our conversations, building a comprehensive record of his deception. And I waited. I played the perfect wife, the devoted caregiver who believed in her husband's miraculous recovery. I celebrated his breakthroughs. With tears of joy, I shared intimate details about our past, which he would later feed back to me as recovered memories. I even suggested that we should consider renewing our wedding vows once he was fully recovered, a suggestion that made him practically glow with satisfaction at his own cleverness. All the while, I was building my case. The breakthrough came when I discovered that Jonathan and Vivian were planning to present their research at the International Conference on Memory and Trauma, scheduled for the following month. Their abstract, which I found in Jonathan's email, was titled Induced False Memory Syndrome in Spousal Relationships, a longitudinal case study. They were going to destroy me professionally as well as personally. In the small world of medical research, being revealed as the subject of such a study would end my career. No hospital, no research institution would trust a doctor whose judgment had been so thoroughly compromised. But they'd made another mistake. The conference was being held at Johns Hopkins, where I still had colleagues and connections. Where I was still respected as Dr. Claire Morrison, not just as Jonathan's victimized wife. I made a few phone calls. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the conference organizer and my former mentor, was horrified when I explained the situation. Claire, this is unethical on so many levels I don't even know where to begin. Human subjects research without consent, psychological manipulation of a spouse, academic fraud. Jonathan could lose his license over this. I know, I said calmly, but I want them to present their paper. I want them to get up on that stage and reveal exactly what they've done. Why? Because I want everyone to see who they really are. And because I have some research of my own to share. The day of the conference, I sat in the back of the auditorium, wearing my most professional suit and my calmest expression. Jonathan and Vivian were in the front row, practically vibrating with excitement about their upcoming presentation. They'd been working on their PowerPoint for weeks, fine-tuning their documentation of my psychological manipulation. They had no idea I was there. When their session was called, I watched Jonathan and Vivian walk confidently to the podium. Jonathan looked handsome and distinguished, every inch the brilliant researcher about to unveil groundbreaking findings. Vivian was radiant beside him, her beauty enhanced by the glow of anticipated triumph. Good afternoon, colleagues. Jonathan began, his voice carrying easily through the auditorium. Today, Dr. Ross and I are pleased to present our research on induced false memory syndrome. Based on a longitudinal study of spousal psychological manipulation, he clicked to his first slide, which showed a clinical timeline of his supposed recovery. The subject of our study is my wife, Dr. Claire Morrison, a forensic pathologist who became my primary caregiver, following a traumatic brain injury that I sustained 6 months ago. A murmur went through the audience. Studying one's own spouse was ethically questionable at best, but Jonathan pressed on. What Dr. Morrison didn't realize, Jonathan continued, his tone becoming more animated, is that my amnesia was entirely fabricated. My memory was never impaired. Instead, I used her belief in my condition to document how easily false memories could be implanted in an emotionally vulnerable subject. The murmur in the audience grew louder, but Jonathan seemed to interpret it as interest rather than disapproval. Through careful manipulation of her emotional responses, I was able to convince Dr. Morrison that she was witnessing my gradual recovery, when in fact I was simply feeding her own stories back to her as recovered memories. The subject became increasingly dependent on these false breakthroughs, to the point where she began to doubt her own recollections when they conflicted with the narrative I was creating. Vivian took over for the next section, her voice crisp and professional. Our documentation includes 6 months of detailed behavioral observations, covertly recorded interactions, and psychological assessments of the subject's increasing dependency and deteriorating judgment. We believe this research demonstrates the profound vulnerability of the human mind to manipulation, particularly in intimate relationships where trust has been weaponized. They were so proud of themselves, so confident in their brilliance, that they didn't notice the growing unrest in the audience. What they interpreted as academic interest was actually horror at the ethical violations they were casually admitting to. But I let them finish their presentation. I let them unveil every cruel detail of their experiment, every violation of my trust and dignity. I let them document their own misconduct with PowerPoint precision. When they opened the floor for questions, I stood up. Dr. Pierce, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the now silent auditorium, Dr. Ross, I'm Dr. Claire Morrison, and I have some questions about your methodology. The blood drained from Jonathan's face. Vivian actually stumbled backward a step. For the first time in 6 months, I had the satisfaction of seeing them completely off balance. You see, I continued, walking slowly down the aisle toward the podium, as the unwitting subject of your research, I'm curious about a few things. First, did you obtain informed consent for this human subject's research? Claire, what are you? Jonathan started, but I cut him off. Dr. Morrison, I corrected icily. We're in a professional setting, Dr. Pierce. Please maintain appropriate boundaries. The audience was completely silent now, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Second, I continued, reaching the front of the auditorium, did your research protocol receive IRB approval? Because I've reviewed the documentation you've been maintaining, and I noticed there's no mention of institutional oversight. I pulled out a folder from my briefcase, the same folder where I'd kept copies of all of Jonathan's research notes. Third, I'm curious about your claims regarding the subject's deteriorating judgment. Are you aware that Dr. Morrison, that's me, has been conducting her own research during this period? I handed a copy of my documentation to Dr. Harper, who was now standing at the side of the room, with several other conference organizers. You see, while you thought you were documenting my psychological manipulation, I was documenting yours. Every hidden camera you installed, every fabricated memory you created, every moment of emotional abuse you inflicted, I have it all recorded, time-stamped, and corroborated with external evidence. The room erupted in whispers, but I wasn't finished. Your research is based on a fundamental flaw in methodology, I said, my voice rising slightly. You assumed that your subject was unaware of the manipulation. But what happens to your conclusions when the subject has been documenting the manipulation all along? What happens when your emotionally vulnerable subject is actually a forensic investigator who specializes in gathering evidence of criminal behavior? Jonathan was now visibly shaking. Vivian had gone completely pale. Dr. Morrison, Dr. Harper interrupted. Are you saying that you've been aware of Dr. Pierce's deception this entire time? Not the entire time, I admitted. For the first 4 months, I was indeed the victim they describe. But once I discovered their plan, I chose to continue the experiment under my own terms. While they thought they were studying me, I was studying them. I turned back to Jonathan and Vivian. You wanted to publish research on psychological manipulation in intimate relationships. Congratulations. Your own behavior has provided excellent data on the subject. The difference is, my research was conducted ethically, with proper documentation, and with findings that will actually contribute to our understanding of domestic psychological abuse. The conference organizers were now huddled in urgent conversation at the side of the room. I could see security guards moving to block the exits. Dr. Pierce, Dr. Ross, Dr. Harper said, stepping forward. I'm going to need you to remain here while we contact the appropriate authorities. What you've described constitutes not only massive ethical violations, but potentially criminal behavior. You can't be serious, Vivian said, finding her voice at last. We've conducted groundbreaking research. The emotional impact on one individual is insignificant compared to the scientific value. The emotional impact on one individual, I interrupted, included months of psychological torture designed to make me doubt my own sanity. It included violation of my privacy, my dignity, and my trust. It included planning to destroy my professional reputation by publishing details of my private life without consent. And it was all conducted by my husband and his lover as part of their plan to divorce me and steal credit for my own documentation of their abuse. The word lover hung in the air like a bomb. I hadn't planned to reveal that detail, but seeing Vivian try to dismiss my suffering as insignificant had pushed me over the edge. Jonathan made one last attempt to salvage the situation. Claire, you're obviously emotional about this. Maybe we should discuss it privately. Dr. Morrison. I corrected again. And there's nothing emotional about evidence, Dr. Pierce. Speaking of which, I should mention that I've already provided copies of all documentation to the medical board, the ethics committee, and the district attorney's office. They're very interested in your research methods. That's when Jonathan and Vivian finally understood that their world had just collapsed. The aftermath was swift and thorough. Within hours, both Jonathan and Vivian were suspended from their positions pending investigation. The medical board launched a full review of their licenses. The university began its own inquiry into research misconduct, and the district attorney started building a case for domestic abuse, fraud, and violation of privacy laws. But for me, the real victory wasn't in their downfall. It was in the moment I walked away from that conference with my dignity intact, my professional reputation enhanced rather than destroyed, and my own research ready for publication. You see, while Jonathan and Vivian had been documenting my supposed psychological deterioration, I had been documenting something much more valuable, a real-time case study of domestic psychological abuse, complete with evidence of the perpetrator's methodology and mindset. My paper titled, The Predator's Playbook, Documenting Psychological Abuse in Intimate Relationships, was published 6 months later in the Journal of Forensic Psychology. It became one of the most cited papers in the field. As for Jonathan and Vivian, they both lost their medical licenses. Jonathan was sentenced to 2 years in prison for domestic abuse and fraud. Vivian received probation and community service, but her career was over. Their groundbreaking research became a cautionary tale about ethics violations and the dangers of unchecked ambition. I divorced Jonathan while he was in prison. The settlement was generous, his guilt made him eager to avoid additional criminal charges, and his lawyer advised complete capitulation to my demands. I kept the house, half of his assets, and all of his research equipment, which I donated to a program supporting domestic abuse survivors. The most satisfying part was that I never had to see him grovel or beg for forgiveness. I simply had my lawyer handle everything, while I focused on rebuilding my life and my career. 3 years later, I'm the director of forensic psychology at Johns Hopkins, specializing in the intersection of domestic abuse and psychological manipulation. I've published extensively on the subject, and I regularly consult with law enforcement on cases involving intimate partner psychological abuse. I never married again. But not because I'm bitter or afraid. I simply learned the difference between love and control, between partnership and predation. I learned that the right person doesn't need to break you down to build you up, doesn't need to make you question reality to feel superior. I learned that the strongest love is the love you have for yourself, the love that says, I deserve better than this, and means it. Sometimes I wonder if Jonathan's accident gave him brain damage after all, not the kind that affects memory, but the kind that destroys empathy, conscience, the basic human capacity to recognize that other people's pain matters. But then I remember the love letters from Vivian that predated his accident, the careful planning that went into their deception, and I realize that some people are just broken in ways that medicine can't fix. The irony is that Jonathan got part of what he wanted. He did produce groundbreaking research on memory, manipulation, and psychological abuse. He just didn't expect to be the subject rather than the researcher. And I suppose, in a way, I should thank him. His cruelty taught me strength I didn't know I possessed. His manipulation taught me to trust my own perceptions. His betrayal taught me the value of my own integrity. But most importantly, his experiment taught me that even the most elaborate deception can't survive contact with the truth. The last time I saw Jonathan was at our divorce hearing. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his own actions. He tried to catch my eye, maybe hoping for some sign of the woman who had once loved him enough to sacrifice everything for his care. But I didn't look at him. I looked straight ahead, focused on my future rather than my past. Because the most powerful revenge isn't destruction, it's indifference. It's building a life so fulfilling, so meaningful, that the person who tried to destroy you becomes irrelevant to your happiness. That night, I went home to my beautiful house, opened a bottle of wine, and toasted the woman I'd become. Not the victim Jonathan thought he'd created, but the survivor who had turned his weapon against him. And for the first time in years, I slept peacefully, knowing that the only person conducting experiments on my life was me. Did you like this story? Tell us in the comments which city you're listening from. If you enjoyed this dramatic tale of betrayal and resurrection, please support us with a super thanks, so we can continue bringing you more incredible life stories like this one. Thank you so much for your support. We look forward to your comments about Claire's amazing journey. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that we highly recommend. There's so much more content on our channel, don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story, with love and respect.